All right, Saagar, what's on your radar?
Well, as many of you know, one of the things we've tracked very closely here is emerging evidence that the COVID-19 pandemic may be the result of a leak from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Specifically, a leak that resulted from funds appropriated to the Chinese-run lab by the United States government, directed by then Dr. Anthony Fauci, and covered up by the Chinese government, the public health establishment, which had millions of dollars on the line, and many more interested parties. But alone, while powerful, the Chinese government, the public health establishment, Fauci, and more could not have done this alone. They were only able to make it fully through nearly the entire pandemic without facing questions about their complicity because of a cover-up perpetrated by the mainstream media. The cover-up was done for the simplest of reasons. In the early days of the pandemic, Trump blamed China. Trump, Pompeo, and others who wanted to cast blame away from themselves as to how terrible of a job they were doing with COVID came out and said that coronavirus had leaked from a lab. Now, the media, not wanting to give an ounce of credibility to Trump or Pompeo, decided on the spot that the lab leak hypothesis was not only untrue, but itself a conspiracy theory, part of some anti-Asian campaign. Thus, the New York Times and others ran with the phrase debunked to refer to it. But now, we have a remarkable addition to the discourse. Former science correspondent for the New York Times, Donald McNeil, who you may remember for having been fired for using the N-word while on a high school trip. He is out with a new missive titled, quote, "How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Lab Leak Theory." Very interesting. Let's review. McNeil reveals that while he was the top science correspondent for the New York Times, writing about their coverage, he penned an article in spring of 2020, which never ran, titled, quote, "New coronavirus is clearly not a lab leak, scientists say." Worse, McNeil admits that the main reason he was so skeptical of the lab leak theory is because, quote, "lab leak theory migrated back to the far right, where it had started. It was championed by folks who brought us Pizzagate and Plandemic and Kung Flu and QAnon and Stop the Steal and January 6th. It was tarred by the fact that everyone backing it seemed to not hate not just Democrats and the Chinese Communist Party, but even the Chinese themselves. It spawned racist rumors like Chinese labs sell their dead animals to food markets." Okay, it's really stunning to see McNeil just say outright that while he was at his position as a top science reporter at the New York Times, he did not take the lab leak seriously because the people who were revealing it were those he considered unsavory. Worse, when he was discussing Nicholas Wade's recent article, which revealed the complicity of Fauci and Dr. Peter Daszak, who served as the conduit of funding from the NIH to the Wuhan Institute of Virology, McNeil writes, quote, "I was offended by some aspects, such as his attacks on Dr. Anthony Fauci of the National Institute of Health and Peter Daszak of EcoHealth Alliance, both of whom I have known for years. I know both are dedicated to saving lives, and they have always told me the truth, or what they honestly believed to be the truth at the time, because evidence sometimes changes." Again, he is admitting the quiet part out loud. McNeil believed Fauci and Dr. Peter Daszak because when they told him there was nothing to see on the lab leak, and he trusted them, and he knew them. I defended McNeil from his firing over what I considered to be a BS reason. But this is the most problematic thing he could have done while in his post, in my opinion. He is essentially admitting that as a science journalist, he took Fauci and Dr. Peter Daszak's word that the lab leak hypothesis was debunked and impossible while he disregarded all the relevant and known information at the time that both of those actors were intimately involved and had a lot to lose if it ever did turn out to be true. He willfully cast anyone pushing the alternative as fringe characters, when if you consider that McNeil himself is a member of the gatekeeping establishment, of course anyone who's discussing this is fringe. Nobody else was allowed to talk about it. This isn't a joke. People were literally banned from Twitter from putting forward the lab leak hypothesis. This prevailing attitude in the media held back legitimate inquiry into the lab leak until Trump was gone. And it is only now that the Biden administration has confirmed many of the facts released by the Trump administration and themselves castigated the WHO report as Chinese propaganda that many of the center-left, or those like McNeil, now feel comfortable admitting that they may very well have ended up being the truth. That the theory that coronavirus is of natural origin has far less evidence at this point than the theory that it leaked from the Wuhan lab. As Josh Rogan of the Washington Post, who was the only person in the entire mainstream media to take this seriously from day one, points out, If you are writing a piece defending yourself from being wrong for a year about the lab leak hypothesis by blaming everyone except yourself for your own wrongness, you haven't learned a thing. You are just engaged in bullshit navel-gazing that literally nobody cares about. He adds, quote, what all these science journalists won't admit is they got taken by their best scientific sources, who misled them on purpose to the detriment of science, journalism, and our public health. The scientists who got it right were the ones who had no conflicts of interest. Exactly right. It leaves us here. At this point now, the lab leak theory is mainstream. People in the media will admit now it's plausible. But that is not enough. As Josh has highlighted on Joe Rogan's show and elsewhere, the scientific community is already moving ahead with $1.2 billion thrown at more of the type of research which may have caused this pandemic in the first place. Turning the spigot on for gain-of-function research, while so many questions remain unresolved, is absolutely the last thing that we should do. And yet, it seems clear that is almost certainly what's going to happen. As memory of the pandemic fades and everybody's vaccinated and people want to move on, the inquiries are not going to pack nearly the same punch that they could have when it mattered. And the reason that they didn't pack a punch is because the media failed to do its job here. And it could be a failure that costs another millions of lives when it all could have been prevented. I think it's just stunning, Crystal, that McNeil, who again, defended him here on the show. I mean, I don't think he should have said what he said, but I don't think he should have been fired. Comes out and is just like, yeah, I didn't believe it because I thought all the people who were saying it were unsavory, and I knew Fauci and I took his word for it. I mean, that's it. He basically said, yeah, I took his word for it.
Actually,
despite all this contravening evidence.
I actually kind of appreciate the honesty.
Yeah, at least,
it's really...
It's nice 16 months later to be like, yeah, I did, I reason why is because Fauci lied to me, I believed it, but it's like, come on,
he just admits it.
Yeah.
That's exactly, it's been obvious from the beginning that the reason that they had this particular blind spot is because they felt that this was the theory coming from the right,
yes,
and therefore it must be wrong. And they didn't go that extra level because, look, when you're a journalist and you're evaluating different sources, yeah, you want to think about their credibility, but they didn't ever think about that scientists may have their own conflict of interest. Mm-hmm. And this isn't about saying scientists are bad or anything silly like that, but scientists are human beings.
Yes.
They have their own professional interests, professional ambitions. They have their own role in these things. They're susceptible to the same type of corruption and bias as any other human being. And that seemed to not be considered whatsoever, especially when you're talking about people like Fauci, who was considered a saint and above any sort of reproach, and who McNeil obviously had a long relationship with, and I'm sure a lot of other science reporters do as well. I actually think this is a really profound look, though, at how political tribalism really undermines just basic facts, data,
absolutely,
evidence, and journalism, because this should have been a legitimate line of inquiry from the very beginning, and the fact that it was not just not considered, but if you even thought about talking about this, you were smeared.
Yeah, you're racist.
And this only changed, by the way, a couple weeks ago. I mean, this is even just a month ago when we were talking about this, I was getting tremendous pushback
from 2 months ago when we had Brett Weinstein on.
Yes.
I saw that. A tremendous amount of pushback.
Tremendous amount of pushback on that. Some of the most pushback, honestly, that I've gotten for any of the segments, any of the many segments that we've done here, because people felt like it came from the right. This is a racist conspiracy theory. It's made up by these people who have bad faith and bad intent. And it is true that some elements of the people who were pushing this did have bad faith and bad intent, and they liked the idea that it was the Chinese fault, et cetera, et cetera. There was another addition to this conversation, which was just so obnoxious and silly, from David Frum, saying that the lab leak hypothesis, even as he now admits it's legitimate line of inquiry, and I'm glad Biden's looking into it and whatever, that the lab leak hypothesis is nevertheless a culture war attack on scientists, and that the only people who've been talking about it are people who are interested in completely discrediting science, which is, I'm not interested in discrediting science. I just want to actually know what happened. That is what science is all about. So it's this weird, twisted, again, it's not our fault we got it wrong. It's their fault, and they're still bad actors, but I guess we should also look into this.
They just can't admit it. They cannot give any sort of credit towards this. Brett Weinstein was talking about this over a year ago. And again, it was smeared as a fringe character. Steve Hilton at Fox News started covering it as well. I think I was on his show the first time maybe the second time that he discussed it. When we started discussing it here, tremendous amount of pushback and all that. How dare you validate a racist conspiracy theory and more? And then Nicholas Wade of the former New York Times comes out, and everybody's like, oh crap! Like, I guess
there
this
must
is
be
true.
something here.
Well, it's like, yeah, well, I mean, why did he have to say everything he put in there? It's not anything that new. I mean, some of it was new, some of it was good reporting, but all of the facts and more have been known for over a year.
Yeah.
And Josh Rogan has been pointing that out in the pages of the Washington Post, completely ignored. So I think it is
it's
just
part of
stunning.
Josh Rogan's war on science.
Yeah, Josh Rogan's war on science, perpetrated and helped by people who are scientists themselves, who said, I guarantee you this came from a lab. Here's the evidence. Or at the very least, I almost certainly think it's come from a lab. Here's where we should go look. And here's why the natural origin theory is very likely not true or has very, very, very little evidence in order to support it at this day and time. And it matters. The Global Virome Project is going forward. $1.2 billion at gain-of-function research. One of the things we learned from that Nicholas Wade piece is how dangerous gain-of-function is. How often that we have lab leaks. All across the world. And even with the best intentions, BS4 or whatever, people are human beings and they don't want to wear hazmat suits whenever they're doing it. Just one time, it goes south, and you could have ended up with millions of people dead. Yeah,
that's exactly right. And look, we don't know for sure, but you just have to look at the evidence and weigh which is the more likely possibility. At this point, there is more evidence on the side of this leaked out of a lab.
There you go.
Coming up, Max Alvarez, Henry Rogers, they'll be here for Team Rising when Rising returns.